The bells rang out over the bayou that December night, carrying on the damp wind like a warning no one heeded. In the glow of lanterns strung along the settlement's single muddy road, families gathered with baskets of bread, game, and jars of molasses to share the Whitlock family's Christmas feast. By morning, the tables would be overturned, the torches guttering in the mud, and entire households lying stiff and silent. What happens when trust at the dinner table becomes a weapon? It was the winter of 1831, on the marshy edge of Street Landry Parish, Louisiana. The Whitlocks had thrown open their doors with unusual warmth. This was not the aristocratic grandeur of plantation banquets. This was the rough-hewn generosity of frontier folk who understood that the swamp gave little without a fight. Guests trudged in with boots dripping mud, children wiping frost from their cheeks, elders clutching shawls against the night damp. At the head of it all stood Martha Whitlock, a broad-faced matron with a smile that belied the steel in her voice. She poured the wine herself, moving from guest to guest, her daughters trailing behind with loaves of cornbread. The goblets clinked, toasts rang, and then came the shudder. At first it was subtle, an uncle gripping the table's edge, a child pressing her hand to her stomach. But within minutes, men collapsed onto benches, women staggered to the door, children whimpered in confusion. The sound of Christmas carols gave way to retching, then screams. The metallic tang of poisoned wine clung to the air, sharper than the swamp's usual stench of rot and stagnant water. This is how entire villages die. The Whitlocks did not stay to comfort. They slipped through the kitchen's back door, lanterns bobbing as they crossed into the cypress gloom. Their footprints pressed deep into the wet earth, swallowed quickly by the rising mist. Neighbors cried out their names, begging for aid, but the family did not return. And here, viewer, is where I need you to pause. Where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. While you're there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this series. By dawn, the sheriff's men found more than 30 souls lifeless in the settlement hall. Children slumped over wooden bowls, couples frozen where they had leaned against each other for strength. Survivors, few as they were, spoke of the wine turning bitter on their tongues, of Martha's steady hand never trembling as she poured. The coroner's notes, scrawled in haste, would later mention a foreign powder, white as ground bone, found at the bottom of one vessel. Foreign powder, white as ground bone, and yet no Whitlock could be found. Their house stood vacant, chairs pulled askew, beds unslept in. A fresh trail of reeds had been parted at the edge of Bayou Teche, where the waters lapped like a heartbeat against the shore. Why would a family poison not just enemies, but neighbors, kin, and children on Christmas night? The swamp holds its secrets well, but the law in 1831 Louisiana was not blind. Men with rifles mounted their horses, swearing to drag the Whitlocks from the mire. But for every path into the cypress, there were a dozen ways out, and every villager knew, once you vanish into the bayou, it is not the sheriff who decides your fate. The hunt had begun. The morning after Christmas, the sound of hooves struck the frozen ground like war drums. Sheriff Abel Carter, a lean man with a scar carved across his jaw from old militia days, led a column of 12 riders. Their breath steamed in the cold dawn as they pressed toward Bayou Teche. The stench of the swamp grew thicker with every mile, mud and decay, mingling with the faint coppery scent carried from the ruined feast. Justice had to ride fast, or vanish. Carter reined his horse at the Whitlock home. Inside, the hearth still smoldered, embers breathing out faint heat. A pot of beans bubbled unattended, as if dinner had been abandoned mid-stir. Chairs were toppled, a shawl draped on the floor like shed skin. No blood, no bodies, just absence and emptiness, more unsettling than violence. From the yard, one deputy called, "Tracks, Sheriff." 4 pairs, heading east toward the cypress. Their lanterns followed the prints into reeds slick with frost, each step vanishing quickly under seepage from the bog. The swamp was erasing the family as surely as it swallowed broken branches. The men pressed on, their rifles balanced, the horses uneasy. Dragonflies hung over stagnant pools, though it was winter. Cypress knees jutted like crooked gravestones. Somewhere distant, a heron croaked, harsh and lonely. And then, silence. Hold! Carter raised a hand. He slid from his horse and crouched by the water's edge. There, pressed into the mud, was the imprint of a wooden crate. Faint, but deliberate. The Whitlocks had carried supplies. This was no panicked flight. This was planned. Planned. Calculated. Cold. Why poison neighbors at Christmas? And why flee with provisions waiting? One deputy spat into the mud. "What kind of folk bring powder to a feast, Sheriff?" Carter said nothing. He only scanned the horizon, where fog tangled low among the cypress branches. They pushed deeper. Hours passed. Boots sank to the ankle. Horses faltered. By noon, sweat plastered shirts to backs, despite the chill. Mosquitoes swarmed even in the cold season, as though the swamp itself conspired to slow the lawmen. When the riders paused at a broken-down hunting shack, Carter pulled from his coat a folded note delivered that dawn by a survivor. December 26, 1831. The wine was ash on my lips. I saw her smile when the first man fell. She meant it. God, forgive me. She meant it. The riders read the words in silence, the weight pressing heavier than their wet boots. What would you do if you saw a neighbor raise her children with one hand and pour death with the other? By late afternoon, the riders reached a place locals called Devil's Hollow, where the trees pressed so close that daylight itself seemed swallowed. Hoofbeats echoed strangely, doubling back. The horses balked, ears flicking. And then a deputy shouted, "Lantern!" pointing toward a faint glow winking between the cypress trunks. The men surged forward, rifles ready, hearts pounding. The glow bobbed, then vanished. Only ripples on the black water remained. A flatboat's track slid into the fog, reeds bending in its wake. The Whitlocks were on the move. The swamp at night was no friend to pursuers. Frogs croaked like broken fiddles, unseen creatures splashed in the reeds, and the smell of wet wood and fish guts clung to the riders. Sheriff Carter's men followed the ripples left by that flatboat until darkness swallowed all trace. Lantern light only bounced back off mist, painting every tree the color of bone. The Whitlocks were no longer fleeing on foot. They had taken to the water. Why does a family carry poison to a feast and a boat to the swamp? At the settlement, grief hardened into fury. Survivors gathered at the church, its bell rope dangling unused, pews crowded with widows and children. Reverend Hollis read from the Psalms, his voice shaking. They have sharpened their tongues like a serpent. Adder's poison is under their lips. Yet, his eyes searched the back door, as if Martha Whitlock might stride in at any moment with that same calm smile. Some swore the Whitlocks had always been different. Their land never seemed to flood, their fields never lost a crop. Others whispered about powders kept in jars, herbs dried in neat bundles along the rafters. But no one had spoken against them until Christmas night laid bodies in rows on church benches. At the sheriff's camp, a young deputy named Silas boiled coffee, black as tar. "We ain't chasing simple folk," he muttered. "They planned this." Carter gave no reply, but his jaw worked like stone grinding stone. Midnight brought a break. A fisherman stumbled into camp, lantern swinging, eyes wide with fear. He claimed he'd seen a family drifting east on a flatboat near Bayou Chicot, their silhouettes black against the rising moon. He'd called out, but the boat never slowed. "Children aboard?" Carter pressed. The man nodded. 2 girls, bundled like winter dolls. 2 girls. bundled like winter dolls. The lawmen saddled up again. Exhaustion be damned. Every hoofbeat splashed mud. Every shout echoed strange. But always the swamp seemed to tilt in favor of the hunted, not the hunters. Near dawn, they found the boat sign again. Reeds bent. A rope frayed on a snag. The deputies argued whether to push east or south. Carter chose east, toward deeper waters. And it was there, in the dim gray of morning, that they found it. A doll. Stuffed rag, one button eye missing, floating belly up among lilies. The swamp takes everything. Was it lost by accident or left as a message? The men scanned the banks with rifles raised, waiting for a musket flash, a shadow, anything. But nothing moved except the fog curling low. One deputy swore he heard a woman's laughter through the trees. Another said it was just barred owls calling. Either way, no Whitlocks appeared. By sunrise, the lawmen were worn thin. Their provisions were running low, their powder damp, their spirits sinking as steadily as their boots. Still, Carter gave the order. They would not turn back, not until they had answers. And somewhere ahead, the Whitlocks slid deeper into the mire, their oars muffled against the black water. Cypress knees jutted from the water like gravestones, the air thick with the smell of rot and wet moss. Mosquitoes whined in clouds, and every splash of a paddle echoed too long, as though the swamp itself repeated the sound. For the Whitlocks, this was sanctuary. For their pursuers, it was a labyrinth. Sheriff Carter's men pressed on despite the terrain. By January 2nd, their boots sloughed apart in the mud, and fever gnawed at one deputy already. Still, the sheriff's jaw stayed fixed. No family poisons a whole village and walks away, he said. His words were less law now, more creed holding the men together. But justice was not the only force moving in those waters. At a trading post near Opelousas, a river pilot swore he had ferried the Whitlocks days earlier. Paid in silver, he said, more than decent folk carry. When pressed, he described Martha Whitlock leaning on the rail, eyes steady as a preacher's. Her children clutched sacks that clinked when set down. Silver, or something heavier? Why carry wealth into exile if you never plan to return? Anecdotes crept from every bayou bend. A trapper claimed he'd shared stew with a Whitlock boy who knew the taste of herbs no backwoods child should name. A washerwoman remembered seeing the daughters brush each other's hair, singing a hymn not heard in any church. Each tale suggested preparation, not panic. Still, the hunters closed in. Near Atchafalaya, Carter's men found a fire pit smoldering, bread crusts half burned, and a scrap of cloth snagged on briar embroidered with a W. But what chilled them most was the iron pot, blackened from within. When the sheriff tapped it with his boot, white residue flaked free. Ash, or arsenic, the deputies argued. Carter said nothing, but wrapped the pot in burlap to carry back. Meanwhile, in the swamps, the Whitlocks struck their own bargain. They avoided settlements, living off fish, wild onions, and what herbs Martha gathered. Nights were spent under palmetto lean-tos, where children whispered about ghosts. Martha hushed them. The dead protect us. They owe us that. The family wasn't fleeing blindly. They were angling south, toward the Gulf, where rumor said smugglers could spirit fugitives into Spanish territory. Yet each mile drew them deeper into country, where the land itself devoured travelers. Men vanished here without crime to their names. How much easier for a branded family. By January 5th, Carter's pursuit had thinned to half his original number. Fever struck one more deputy. Another drowned, crossing a bayou at night. The swamp was collecting its due, and each man asked quietly, was the price worth it? But Carter pressed on, spurred less by duty than by the gnawing riddle. Why poison the wine? Why doom an entire community on Christmas night? The question hung over every mile like thunder, waiting to break. And somewhere in the mist, a flatboat shifted again, carrying a family who might never see open ground. The swamp keeps its secrets. What drove the Whitlocks to such ruin, and who else already knew the answer? The courthouse in Street Landry Parish smelled of mildew, ink, and old pine boards. Clerks shuffled papers, while Sheriff Carter leaned heavy on the counter, demanding records. If the Whitlocks had traded coin for passage or bought supplies, some trace must exist. Paper did not rot as quickly as flesh. The clerk produced a ledger dated December 24th, 1831. Ink bled where damp had kissed the pages. Among entries of flour, rope, and tobacco was a line that made Carter still. 1 cask red wine, purchased by J. Whitlock, credited to parish store. The very cask poured at the Christmas feast. So the poison had been chosen, not stumbled upon. Carter carried the ledger into the lamplight. He bought it same day, he said, voice flat. He knew. The deputy shifted uneasily. If purchase meant planning, then the Whitlocks' crime was no sudden fit of madness, but cold preparation. Back in the swamp, the family camped along a ridge where owls called and mud sucked at every step. Martha set herbs to boil, the bitter steam filling their lean-to. Her youngest coughed through the night. Jacob Whitlock sat apart, staring at the swamp water. Some claimed later he muttered like a man torn between guilt and resolve. Yet the tale grew murkier. At a tavern in Baton Rouge, travelers spoke of seeing Martha alone weeks before Christmas, meeting quietly with a man in black coat and hat. No name remembered, just a silver flask that clinked when set down. Who was he? And what bargain was struck over strong drink? Maybe they were only the hand, not the mind, Carter muttered when told. The idea cut both ways. If the Whitlocks had acted under another's guidance, the poison might not end with them. The lawmen pressed on with new urgency. They searched cabins, questioned boatmen, demanded to see cellar shelves. Some villagers balked. Better let them go, one man said. Swamp'll take 'em soon enough. But Carter's eyes blazed. And if it don't? If they come walking out to do it again? What would you do, chase them into the mire, or turn back and pray the earth swallowed them whole? By mid-January, another clue surfaced. A ferryman swore he'd carried a woman calling herself Mary White and 3 children across Atchafalaya. She'd paid with a gold brooch. Her eyes, he said, looked like someone already gone. Mary White, Martha Whitlock. Names shift, shadows stay. The deputies rode harder, though the swamp thinned into coastal marsh. Every mile south carried the scent of salt, gull cries overhead, and the taste of brine on the wind. If the Whitlocks reached open Gulf waters, pursuit would be meaningless. They could vanish into Spanish ports or farther still. But just when it seemed the trail would dissolve into sea, a fresh report arrived, one that cracked the case wide open. A letter, intercepted from New Orleans, addressed not to Whitlock but to a merchant in Mobile. Its script described a family of 4, carrying knowledge and powders, seeking passage abroad. The signature was smudged, but the handwriting looping, precise matched a hand Carter had already studied in the parish ledger. It was Martha's. The Whitlocks were not vanishing into swamp fog. They were negotiating, and the price they offered might be far more dangerous than silver or gold. Salt hung in the air, like a warning. By late January, 1832, gulls screamed over the marshes, and tides pulled the bayou's black water toward the Gulf. Sheriff Carter's men reached the coast ragged and hollow-eyed, their boots caked with salt crust. They had followed the Whitlocks nearly 100 miles, and now the chase threatened to spill beyond the country's edge. At a dockside tavern in New Orleans, the search sharpened. The place stank of tar, sour ale, and shrimp shells. A ship's carpenter remembered a family fitting the Whitlocks' description, asking about berths to Havana. Another sailor swore he'd seen them in the fish market, the mother bargaining fluently in French. She wasn't scared, he said, shaking his head. She was measuring us. If Martha Whitlock had learned tongues and trade, who had been her teacher in that backwater parish? Records in the harbor office offered a sharper clue. On January 26th, a schooner called La Belle Espérance listed provisions for 4 unnamed passengers. The handwriting on the note matched again the same elegant curl to the letter G, the same deliberate ink blot where an E trailed. Martha's hand had traced these words, but the schooner never sailed. A storm barreled across the Gulf, tearing sails and snapping masts. Witnesses claimed they saw the Whitlocks huddled under the awning, Martha clutching a sack tight to her chest as rain sheeted down. Then the vessel vanished into gray squall and did not return to port. Did the sea claim them? Or did they ride that storm into a different harbor? Meanwhile, Carter's deputies split. Some argued to call off the hunt, let the Gulf bury them. Others urged pursuit by hiring passage on another vessel. Carter himself stood silent at the wharf, coat soaked through, eyes fixed where horizon met lightning. He had given nearly a month to this chase, lost men to fever, drowned horses, and still had no bodies to count. One fisherman later whispered that he saw a flatboat drift ashore east of Biloxi, children bundled beneath tarpaulin, a woman's voice singing low. He swore it was no drowned whale, but a hymn, steady and calm. When he approached, the boat slid back into the surf, as if pulled by unseen current. The Gulf keeps its bargains. By February, reports spread inland. A merchant in Mobile claimed to have sold spices to a pale man with the Whitlock jawline. A nun in Pensacola described a woman lighting candles for her lost flock. Each tale blurred truth and rumor, until the Whitlocks became more ghost than flesh. But the poison shadow had not lifted. Back in Louisiana, fear thickened. Villagers locked cellars, burned herbs thought suspicious, and tested wine before Sunday suppers. A mother in Opelousas refused to let her daughter attend church feasts. A planter near Lafayette hired a taster, a boy barely 12, whose only task was to sip first. Trust had died that Christmas. Still, Carter would not rest. If the Whitlocks lived, he vowed, they carried knowledge too dangerous to vanish unchecked. Powders, tinctures, ways to slip death into any cup, he told the parish court. That knowledge is worth more than silver and deadlier than lead. And in New Orleans, a final fragment surfaced, an unsigned page found in a sailor's trunk. It listed herbs, roots, and dosages in tidy columns, a recipe book of careful poison. The signature at the bottom was faint but legible. M. Whitlock. Was this the proof of survival? Or a relic left behind to mislead? The cypress swamp at Manchac spoke in whispers. Mosquito wine, frogs lowing like cattle, the faint hiss of water against roots. By March of 1832, the Whitlocks had become less a family than a folktale, and Sheriff Carter carried that folktale back into the trees. He had one new lead. A burned cabin discovered by trappers 2 days' ride upriver, its walls scorched, its chimney collapsed in on itself. Inside, among the char and ash, they found fragments of glass vials melted to the hearthstone. A single iron pot lay blackened but intact, ringed with powder residue. Whatever had been brewed here, it was not soup. Carter knelt in the ruin, ash clinging to his boots, and felt the faintest press of footprints in the mud outside small, likely a child's. The Whitlocks had been here, but why burn their shelter? Villagers whispered that the family destroyed every trace, knowing that even one recipe could damn them. Others believed it was punishment from God, lightning striking down sinners. Carter studied the ruins and saw something else. Method. The fire had been set in corners, not the stove. Controlled, intentional. They had erased themselves, and yet erasure left echoes. Among the ashes lay a singed scrap of paper, half legible. Ink blurred, but words survived. December 25th. Bitter almonds, 1 ounce for each. Carter held it with tongs, heart racing. Bitter almonds meant cyanide. 1 ounce was enough to fell a man in minutes. This was no accident, no rumor. This was ledger, confession, recipe. A nearby farmer swore he'd heard voices in the swamp at night. A woman teaching children by lantern glow, her tone patient, instructive. "Repeat after me," she'd said, though the words carried indistinct through the trees. Teaching letters or teaching mixtures? What would you do, hearing that in the dark? Tell the sheriff or hold your tongue, fearing a knock at your door? In Baton Rouge, the newspapers printed half-truths. Christmas massacre family still at large. Authorities believe swamp harboring fugitives. Some editorials urged mercy. Desperation breeds desperate acts. Others demanded blood. Carter pressed on. Each day, deputies deserted. One, fever-struck, muttered that he dreamed of women slipping powders into his cup, smiling as he drank. Another simply vanished, his empty horse found tethered by the river. Fear eats men faster than bullets. Still, scraps of the Whitlocks passage surfaced. A child's wooden toy left in mud. A trail of onion skins near a collapsed shack. A freshly carved cross nailed to a tree. Signs both ordinary and ominous, like breadcrumbs leading nowhere. By spring, Carter faced the truth. The swamp had swallowed the Whitlocks. Whether alive, hidden in its green cathedrals, or drowned in its endless channels, no man could say, but the burned cabin lingered as a wound. Because in those ashes lay proof that the family had not fled blindly. They had planned, prepared, and taught. Someone, somewhere, carried their knowledge forward. And knowledge, once loosed, never dies. So Carter returned to the parish with nothing but rumors, and that charred scrap, muttering to his deputies, as if to convince himself, they're not gone, just waiting. The swamp keeps its secrets. Spring gave way to summer, and with it came silence. No new sightings of the Whitlocks, no fresh rumors drifting from the swamps, no scraps of cloth or children's toys left behind. To some, it meant the family had perished. To others, it meant they had slipped the noose entirely, crossing into Spanish lands or vanishing aboard a smuggler's ship. But silence is never empty. By midsummer, strange echoes haunted the parishes along the Mississippi. A man in Plaquemine claimed his well water turned bitter overnight, killing livestock that drank it. A boarding house matron swore a young woman stayed with her for 3 nights, pale and polite, carrying a satchel that clinked like glass. She left before dawn, leaving behind a scent of crushed laurel and almonds. Coincidence? Or the Whitlock daughters moving through the world? Sheriff Carter, worn to leather by grief and futility, resigned his badge. He was last seen drifting a skiff into the swamp alone, muttering that unfinished work never lets a man rest. His deputies buried his hat when he didn't return. Whether he found the Whitlocks or they found him, no one ever learned. But stories thickened like fog. Children whispered of a woman in gray who wandered the levees at dusk, offering penny candy that tasted strange metallic. Old men swore that in certain bayous, if you cupped your hand to the water, it gleamed faintly blue under moonlight, some mineral, or some leaching poison, seeded long ago. The parish records closed the Whitlock file in 1833, ruling the case unsolved. Yet the silence after their disappearance grew heavier than the crime itself, because absence, like poison, spreads unseen. Even decades later, when new settlers cleared land by Manchac, they found glass bottles buried in the muck. Some cracked, some sealed tight with wax, their contents still sharp enough to burn the nose. No label marked them, only a faint W scratched into the glass. And so the Whitlocks never truly vanished. They became a presence, diffuse as mist, threaded into every cautionary tale. Don't take gifts from strangers. Don't drink what you don't pour yourself. Don't wander the swamp at night. Lessons written not in scripture, but in fear. The silence was their legacy, an unfinished chord that hummed beneath every gathering, every communal meal. The question was not where they went. The question was when they would return, because poison waits, and patience is its only strength.